Hi everyone, I'm Alessandra Miano, PhD candidate at University of Campania, and I'm really glad to introduce my contribution, Museums as Multivocal Platforms, Enhancing Community Practices through Digital Technology. The presentation mostly aims at outlining how the enhancement of the intangible dimension of cultural heritage could be expressed in the museum spaces as display of stories, processes, gesture beyond the physical artwork and spaces to a polyphonic storytelling which involves the participation of different points of view expressing a necessary interculturality of cultural heritage itself. And in this dimension, multivocality of cultural heritage requires the participation of communities as holders of the collective memory and on the other side as activators of the narrative, so pushing towards a dimension of co-curatorship of the exhibition up to a possible co-creation, so elevating everyday object to a meaningful artwork. And in this vision of intercultural openness, the use of digital technologies integrated into the space and made it invisible in the formal components, making it possible to amplify the emotional narrative of the artworks and spaces, starting from their material value, but overlapped in a digital dimension capable of linking the digital and the real. So, in a discussion of the topic, are necessary some preliminary forwards in order to have a broad view of the different components that relate each other. And the first aspect is about the contemporary dimension of cultural heritage, considering enhancement as a possible constant innovation, as cultural heritage is no longer substance of universal value, but instead is a process. So a becoming set of goods to be put back into circulation, a resource for reflection, emotion, growth, and therefore as a personal but also in a collective process. And this means also considering cultural heritage as open to a rereading and to a counter narration. And this is the only way to design an exhibition system as a complex system that could express the polyphony and interculturality of different points of view, and at the same time as like hypertextual, so a dimension that no longer requires a sequential path, but mostly as fragmented, animated by the connections oriented by the visitor themselves. And this approach implies starting from the intangible component of the cultural heritage, not just as a value expressed by the artwork that, of course, could be explicit or implicit, but as an object itself linked to everyday life, practices, and rituals of communities of reference. In this sense, the UNESCO Convention is really clear in underlining how intangible heritage refers to practices, but also to instrument objects that communities, group, but also individuals recognize as part of their own identity. And the consideration of communities is not static, but is like understood in a dynamic dimension of interaction with space and of relational connection with changes in society. And this view is also finally being integrated into the ICOM 22 definition of museum, which updates the previous one of 2007, and so referring explicitly to community participation in order to offer varied experiences. And so moving from cultural heritage, the next step is think about the museum and how the change in cultural heritage concerns the museum dynamic as an institution, but of course in the process of communication and fusion of the contents. And museum so become laboratories of change, both personal and collective. And this can be explained starting from the value of the intangible dimension of cultural heritage and thus focusing more and more attention from the physical artworks on display to the stories as capable of evoking a declination but also a representation in the present starting from the awareness of the past. And this requires also to design the design of an exhibition system that is capable of transforming the raw material in understandable communication, information, and knowledge, which could make explicit the plurality and polyphony into the exhibition infrastructure. In this direction, we can explain why museums become a sort of sensescape in which fusion needs to move away from being centered only on the vision, but involving other senses in a synesthetic approach as capable of communicating gestural memory relating to the object and thus involving the different senses in the storytelling. And this means, on one side, considering bodily involvement as the fully meaning making of the outside, and in which we can experience our position in the world, but starting from the position of the others, starting from the knowledge of the others. And so proxemics therefore moves towards a condition of performative museology in which stories requires the bodily and the gestural involvement of visitors in order to be fully understood. In this sense, museums become reactive spaces to foster participatory process. So if we said that museums could express the different position, this is done through the direct involvement of those who hold this value, and so looking beyond the walls and outside the museums. And so to speak of participation means, on one hand, to involve visitors to the point of triggering mechanism of identification in the story, but also to trigger dialogues as the artwork becomes relevant for the ability to spark conversation. And on the other, there is a shift toward a progressive co-curating of exhibitions by communities and groups. So breaking down a clear-cut distinction between authors and readers, producers and spectators, creators and interpreters as to form a circuit to the point that visitors stage everyday object as not just as curator but as co-creator. And this concept is clearly expressed in the case of the Ettore Wattelli Foundation in Oxano Tauro, in which is on show a collection of 20th century rural objects collected since 1917. And in this case, the foundation starts from the narrative potential of the object, capable of expressing fragments of everyday life, displaying this like vertiginous visual and occupying the entire space of the wall as to create composition in which the visitor could feel like really immersed. And the foundation also organizes a series of meetings that are called the plural histories, in which using like the performative expedient involving not all like the community of reference, but also immigrants, as to transmit a ritual gestural dimension linked to the past tradition, but also re-embodied in complexity of present. And so, as Del Puya said, the common object could offer a significant opportunity for sharing a recognized identity, both on a human level, but mostly on historical level. So, referring to the heritage and of knowledge and practice that produce it. And in the analysis of the contemporary dimension of cultural heritage and museums, and so their relationship with society, it's necessary also to take into account the entry of digital technology into every aspect of community and individual life, to the point of also affecting the organization, the communication, the fruition of artworks in the museum. In this sense, the first point is like the concept of digital cultural ecosystem, a condition that develops in the context of what Jackie defines as convergence culture as a flow of contents traveling across multiple media platforms, so transmedia, but at the same time also multi-device. In this dimension, digital ecosystem is defined as an interconnected system in which its elements interact with each other and with the environment itself. And so to speak of digital cultural ecosystem means to considering also the cultural heritage itself as invested by the use of digital technologies. In this heritage continuum dimension as accessible in increasingly shared and fluid way between material and immaterial contents, and above all as connection between the physical and the virtual spaces. So pushing the museum out of the physical dimension and connecting collection of museums, cultural institutions, archives, online repositories and territories. But on the other hand, also think about the digital technologies as a situating, overlapping in a real space. And this also implying sees museum as more and more as a network. So creating partnership between different local and non-local institutions, and so to sharing values and innovation. And thus, this widespread entry of digital technology into society and cultural heritage and heritage continuum concern, of course, also the museum, which experience a post-digital condition, a condition of assimilation in which digital technology provides every aspect of internal organization, no longer as like a stand-alone operation, but as a part of the body of the museum that is integrated into every sector. And on the other hand, referring to digital technology is also interesting in way in which think about the ecosystemic thinking, in the sense of integrating technological intervention into the cultural dimension of museum, so taking into account what is the level of the acceptance of technology in order to be understood. And so in the consideration of post-digital museums, it thus relevant to consider that digital technologies express a strong potential in the link with the physical museum space as emotional amplifiers of that specific space as a place of memory. And the dimension of digital technology is physical but mediated by the presence of digital tech, moving this sense as a dialectic between the real space and digital devices, stimulating awareness of the space through embodied interaction with the environment and the artwork on the space. And in this sense, Borsotti emphasizes how this perspective activates new perspective experiences, making the visitors as relational triggers itself. Talking about digital implies referring to mixed reality technologies defined by the virtuality continuum diagram, in which the characteristic of the real and virtual dimensions are intertwined at left different levels from a dimension of augmenting reality, so as the overlapping of a digital layer to the reality, to augmenting virtuality as the integration of elements of reality into the virtual dimension. And considering these technologies in the digital heritage graph, they are compared on the basis of two parameters. The first is like the level of situativity and thus the link with physical space. And the second is the affordance as to ability to stimulate physical actions and gestures. The authors underline three different levels of digital. The first is the augmenting, so to physical technological devices overlapped to physical space as the most famous augmented reality apps. The second is the integrated dimension, in which digital tech is integrated into the space as an invisible layer that needs the body gesture to be enabled. And the third one is the actuated dimension, in which the user can modify directly the digital interface itself. And in particular, focusing on integrated dimensions, central is the reference to the tangible interactions defined as embedded and embodied interactions, considering in the first case the integration of digital technology is smart objects, where technology is embedded as like a narrative layer in a physical and direct relationship with visitors, and on the other hand, the embodied interaction that refers to the design of sensitive environment activated by the physical movement of the visitors. Therefore, moving on case studies is possible to highlight a different level of participatory involvement, and in this sense, it's also interesting to compare how this involvement can take place with an absent level of digital technologies or in a total integrated digital dimension. I started by saying that museums open their collection to intercultural vision, and this is the specific case of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, where is ongoing a multivocal involvement. And in this image, the artwork Night Watch by Rembrandt is at center, and in which the experience activated by the museum is twofold. Because on the one hand, there is Operation Watch, that is a project of conservation and restoration of the artwork inside a transparent box so capable of involving visitors in the process. But on the other side, this artwork is the beginning of a process of reinterpretation of the painting in the light of the decolonization of the artworks in the museum, showing backgrounds, details never brought to light, which could make visible another narrative, so a reinterpretation of those works. And next to the paintings, there are two labels. One for traditional captioning of the works, that is like the most common one, of course, and the other is a reinterpretation that starts with Black community as slavery and thus emphasizes why, despite the massive presence of Black community in Amsterdam, they were not represented in the painting. And this reinterpretation is present throughout the exhibition, highlighting different invisible aspects of what is visible and represented, such as like marketing as slavery, telling the backstories of famous people in the city, or the relationship of the slavery with the church, with the food, with presence in the city of Amsterdam, and the role in the society. Thus, if it is a way of narrating heritage as polyphonic, the use of integrated technologies can amplify the perception of different points of view in the fusion of content, so establish a direct bodily relationship with symbolic objects from the past, in this case using smart objects. And the exhibition at the museum in The Hague tells of the Atlantic Wall built by the Nazis during the Second World War. And the exhibition overlaps different points of view and different stories of the Atlantic Wall, but staging three different perspectives: the civilian, the official, and the German. So letting the characters interact with visitors through symbolic objects. So the visitor at the entrance could choose an object such as the blue Delft cup, once used as a Christmas present for German soldiers and which tells the Nazi perspective, or the bracelet worn by an official, which reflect the perspective of the Dutch official. And so the object narrates the perspective of these different characters, and so overlapping different point of view of the same event. And this is the only tools for activating the installation. Visitor involvement could move also through different scenarios as through performative involvement, leading visitors to perform action in a space as if physical experience a ritual or gesture from the past. Inside the Museum of Everyday Life in Odense are staged periods rooms which tell the story of Danish history during the 19th, conceived as immersive rooms full of details that could give an overall view of the period. And the last room of the museum is designed as like a closed showroom in which visitor can try on, feeling like part of the storytelling as like in a sort of performance. And the point is to touch, to sit, to rediscover gesture from the past, and all the senses are involved in this journey in without any use of digital artifice. And so the relationship is immediate, tangible, and tactile. But the performative dimension can be amplified using technological tools, as in the case of the sensitive environment designed by Studio Azzurro for Shanghai Expo. And in sensitive city, places are told through the testimony of those inhabit them. So 800 people who can be questioned by the public with a gesture of the hand, a gesture that become an interaction, a sensitive penetration into like live stories in personal glances at the city. And in the video, each person narrates the journey from the home to an iconic place in the city of Materia. And this narration makes it possible to make visitors part of this collective performance, ideally connecting to the gesture of holding down the narrator with the protagonist of the stories, and so create a strong physical connection with characters, and on the other hand also superimposing a multimedia narration capable of simultaneously involving different senses and different level of the stories. But as I said, visitors could be also co-curator of the exhibition, as in the case of Netherlands Photo Museum in Rotterdam, and starting with the exhibition in collaboration with Steenberg Stipendium and Dutch Photography Awards, in which together with a selected jury, visitors are asked to choose from 5 projects on display. And this request is made like in the most traditional form, so with a sheet of paper and a pen. But still at Netherlands Photo Museum, within the exhibition, the Gallery of Honors as like an overview of the history of Dutch photography. Visitors, through the use of an app, can participate in 99 plus 1, so designed to display the missing photo from those present, or also from some personal, as to indicate a photo that among the others represent a cultural history and so need to be staged. In the depot in Rotterdam, this topic is also amplified through the use of an app in the biennial program Family of Objects, which is starting from selection of specific objects, invite visitors to find connection with their object in a space, such to create a family of objects to be exposed, and to look for a partner. In this case is Maya, that is like by Finnish ceramist Erna Altonen. And by scanning the QR code, it is possible to answer a series of questions to identify the characteristics of a possible partners. And based on this answer, 13 possible partners were identified, so leaving the public the opportunity to vote. And finally, the choice was exposed as like the entrance of the museum. But the participation of visitors also takes the form of co-creation based mostly on the value of personal object as like a representative of communities and value. And Pia Kami's work called A Pot for a Latch is a site specific for the exhibition in Copenhagen Contemporary, and work consists of a grate from which visitors are welcome to take an object on the condition that they leave a personal object from their own, along with a description of the object and the history. And so to be exposed are personal object whose value is intimate, but in this dimension is also shared in ongoing circuit of experiences. And from the collaboration between GIFT or Horizon 2020 project and the agency Next Game, the exhibition Your Story is set up in the Museum of Serbia was to invite visitors to contribute their own stories to the museum by showing an object that is relevant for their life, and a public call online resulting in a multiple donation of objects that were then 3D scanned and documented by the team. And over 6 months of collaboration time, the museum and Next Game used those items to develop a hybrid installation which digital version of everyday object of today were paired with historical object in the exit project. And so using tools as like augmented reality and mostly art codes too, the visitor scanning the art code could see like the connection between the online personal object and the physical exhibit. Thus, moving to the conclusion, the central point that emerged from this excursus is the need to explicit the intangible, to put it on display. And this can be done either through a multivocal narrative that could be verbal and bodily, but also through the knowledge of the value of the object as practices. And this dimension requires the participation of community to activate the content. And therefore, to the comparison of different case studies, and although the dynamics of involvement is not fixed and digital technology, of course, is not always the best option, it is possible to align the opportunities offered by the use of digital technology and the close link between digital technology, space, and storytelling. The main point are like the opportunity of blending materiality and interactive storytelling as dialecting a simultaneous communication between the real and the virtual, the hypertextuality as opportunity to prompt different connections using the potentiality of the multimodality to enhance multivocal vision, overcoming the traditional proxemics using tangible interactions as a direct relationship where technology is invisible and integrated, and the relation between on-site and offline. So the business could go beyond the wall as to establish a long-term relationship between the museums and community. So what emerged is that museum today is able to reach out into new worlds, to go beyond space, reinterpreting contents, but also making visible what is now invisible. And this means considering that the polyphony of museum requires a constant participation of communities, individuals, and groups to be alive, to become a place of experiences and stories that are capable of connecting past and